Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started very shortly. We're just going to make sure that the waiting room is emptying and the webinar is filling up. Thank you so much for all coming along this evening for the first of our winter talks. We have the fantastic James Harding Morris with us. Great to see a good number of people joining. And James is going to be talking this evening about Endemic, which is also his brilliant book, which I've got my copy of here. James is actually a member of staff at the BSBI, so he is our country's manager, and it's fantastic to work alongside him day to day. But he's also got a really very interesting life outside the BSBI. He's got a history in lots of different parts of conservation, working from Back to the Brink and the RSPB. And he has a huge range of different interests in the natural world and beyond. Without much further ado, I'm going to hand over to James, but I do just want to point out we have the Q&A feature in use tonight. So if you'd like to ask any questions, do put them in there at any point. We are recording this webinar as well, and we'll come to those questions as far as possible at the end of the presentation. But without any more further ado, I'm going to pass over to James.
Hello, everybody. It's absolutely wonderful to be here this evening. I hope we're having a grand time. I'm going to be talking to you about endemic species in Britain. And I will talk about why Britain in a moment. But you might be sitting there thinking, well, I've joined this webinar. I don't know what an endemic species is. What are you talking about? So let me rewind and take you to my first proper slide. So really, a few years ago, before I started working at the BSBI, quite a while ago, one day, I was walking and I was thinking, what happens if we go from this map here to this map here? Let's imagine some Atlantis-style disaster happens. What is lost? And of course, the answer is absolutely everything is lost. So let's imagine then that the human population is safely teleported away. And we're talking about species and conservation. And of course, everything that lives on Britain is lost as well. But what's the question is, what is irreplaceably lost from a kind of natural history conservation perspective? And that's really interesting because that's when you realize that many, in fact, the majority of our species are found elsewhere in the world. So our Quercus robur, the so-called English oak, is found far beyond England. The Cornish heath is found elsewhere in the world. And the beautiful purple saxifrage is found kind of around the Arctic Circle. So if Britain disappeared, of course, the global populations of these species would be reduced, but these species would still exist somewhere else. So what would be the species that we would lose entirely from the face of the Earth if Britain was to vanish? These are our endemic species, an organism restricted to a single defined geographic location. Sometimes you will see a species referred to as endemic to Europe or something like that. But more often, and I think most usefully, it's used to describe species with very restricted ranges found within a single country or perhaps an island. And when it's used in that sense, a national endemic, you realize how threatened these species are. Of the 938 extinct species and infraspecies on the IUCN Red List, 93.8% of them were nationally endemic. So by being restricted to a single country, you are already a species with a restricted range, but you're also at the whims of conservation within a single place. So our endemics are susceptible to conservation issues and are important. And so I became really interested in thinking about what are the endemic species in Britain. And I found that when I started looking at this 5, 6 years ago, that at the time there was not a comprehensive list of endemic species in Britain that had been made, which I found really baffling because we kind of think of conservation as being very well developed in Britain, but this had never been drawn together. So I started drawing together all the sources that I could find, emailing different organizations and trying to pull together something that felt like a comprehensive list. So this is what I ended up with. So this is Britain and this is species. And you'll see from my little asterisk there, there are many other additional subspecies. And some of these, like the vascular plants, I'm indebted to the work of Tim Rich, who published with the BSBI a list of endemic species. I was lucky that when I started researching this bug life, for the first time, we're trying to draw together a list of endemic invertebrates in Britain. Some of these other ones, it's just been lots of slow and painful research. And as you can see, with the mosses, there's a question mark. With the vertebrates, there's a question mark, because that really depends whether you think the Scottish crossbill is a real species or not. And I personally doubt that it is. So here is our endemic breakdown. About 700 species found in Britain that are found nowhere else in the entire world. Now, the astute amongst you will be thinking, okay, James, where are the fungi? And for those of you that were thinking that, here is a slide about fungi. It is very difficult to know if we have any endemic fungi. The picture here, which is my hand, shows the Earth star Geastrum britannicum, which for a time was thought to be entirely restricted to Britain, but has since been found elsewhere in Europe, so it is not an endemic. And there are other fungi. In fact, there are lots of fungi that have only been found in Britain. In fact, there are 300 plus like microfungi species, rusts and so on, that have only ever been recorded from Britain. But based on the work that I've read, because this probably more reflects our poor understanding of fungal distributions rather than the fact that Britain is home to many hundreds of endemic fungi. That will be interesting in future years to see as research on fungi progresses, whether we end up with any that we can say are truly endemic species. Now, obviously, I'm here to talk about plants, but I'm also just really quickly going to show you a few pictures of some of the very small number of endemic invertebrates that we have, like the northern February red, this stonefly, a member of an ancient lineage of insects, which is only known now from the Highlands of Scotland. On this slide here, we have at the right-hand side the horrid ground weaver, which is only found within a single kilometre square in Plymouth. And on the left, at the top, we have a zoomed-in picture of the Celtic woodlouse. And then below, you can see just how big that is compared to a 5p piece, which has only ever been found at a few sites in Wales and a single allotment in Bristol and nowhere else in the world. And then this invertebrate here, this is the British false flat-backed millipede, which I have a kind of special fondness for because when I tracked it down whilst writing my book and took this picture of it, I didn't realize at the time that this was the first ever photograph taken of this species, which kind of goes, which I find fascinating, because it kind of shows that our endemic species are not necessarily at the forefront of our minds, because if they were, surely all of them would have been photographed and we'd know all about them. But this was a species that until I found it, nobody had seen it in about 30 years. Anyway, that's enough talking about fungi and invertebrates. We're here to talk about plants. So this is a breakdown of endemic plants in Britain. So it's 641 species, and I've broken them down broadly by group. You can see we have nearly 300 hawkweeds found nowhere else in the world, almost 150 brambles, about 60 buttercups, 50 elms, depending on where your opinion sits on elm taxonomy. And I'm aware that that's a kind of contentious area that's kind of under investigation at the moment. 36 white beams, 31 dandelions, 7 eyebrights, but once again, I think eyebrights are about to change as well. 5 sea lavenders, and then 16 members of other groups, which I've kind of bundled together just to make this pie chart manageable. But that includes ladies' mantles and a few other species as well. And you might be thinking, James, why are you just talking about Britain? Well, when I started researching this, I was working in conservation in Britain. At the time of working on this, hadn't worked on projects in Ireland, and so I focused my attentions to Britain. But at the end of this presentation, I am going to talk a little bit about endemic species that are Irish and British and Irish as well. So, but what I want to do now is just kind of share some of these amazing species with you. And we'll see how far we get in the time that we have available to us, because I can talk about these species for a very long time. So, the first one I want to share with you is the Scottish primrose. And I think that this is quite possibly our most beautiful endemic species. It's endemic to Scotland. It's found on the very, very northern coast of the Scottish mainland, and then across many of the islands of the Orkney archipelago. Usually found on kind of maritime turf close to the sea. It flowers twice a year in May and July. Its overall distribution remains unchanged since the 1960s, but it hasn't been found on some remote areas of Orkney in recent years. I went to go see this species in 2023. I went and met John Crossley on Orkney, and he suggested that it would be really useful for me to go out to one of the other islands and try and find Scottish primrose somewhere where it hadn't been recorded. And so I went out to Rousey. I went up to the kind of north east corner of the island and strode around the cliff tops. And I got absolutely blasted with rain and absolutely sodden. And then the sun came out, at which point I got dive bombed by some skuas. And so after giving it a good hour of wandering it around in those conditions and not managing to find any, I went back to mainland, Orkney mainland, and went and saw it on the coast of Orkney there, where it is a gorgeous flower. But it would be really interesting if anyone's visiting Orkney to have a look for these on some of the other islands and try and double check that those populations are still present. And in terms of the origins of this species, this just seems to be a species that has kind of diverged from its ancestors within Britain. The next species is the great ormberry. So we've gone from Scotland to Wales. The great ormberry is a cotoneaster. It is our only native cotoneaster. I don't know about you. Usually, when I think about cotoneasters, I think, oh, that's a bit of a devious non-native generally. And I also think, and also what a pain they are to identify. But we have one really lovely cotoneaster, and it's this one, the Great Ormberry Cotoneaster cambricus. It was discovered in 1783, and it was discovered by John Wynne Griffith, who was an MP and a botanist, which are like two skills that it's really hard to imagine in one individual nowadays, but clearly was possible at the time. And this plant is only found on the Great Orme in North Wales, where 6 original wild plants remain. And because this is an endemic species and it's not found anywhere else in the world, those 6 wild plants are the entire population of this species in the entire world, which I think is absolutely mind-blowing. Now, there are more plants on the Great Orme because for a few decades, this species has been grown in cultivation, it's been bulked up, plants have been planted out. And so the actual number of plants on the Great Orme is higher, but only 6 of them are kind of true self-sown, self-willed plants, as it were. And what's interesting in a kind of negative um, meaning of interesting is that with all of the planting of additional bushes out there, nobody has found a new self-sown plant in all those years. So there is this, why is that? What's going on? Why aren't these things regenerating in the wild? Part of that could be that on my walk around the Great Orme, there are a lot of non-native cotoneasters kind of spreading into natural habitats. And it could be that part of the reason that Cotoneaster cambricus is not kind of regenerating in the wild, it could be that a lot of the places that it would like to grow are already occupied by other non-native cotoneasters. So this is something that is quite possibly threatened by non-native invasive species, which is a real shame. Though with all the efforts going to grow it on in cultivation, its existence is secure, and with the conservation work behind it, its presence in the wild seems secure. But whether we can get it back to a point where it's truly self-sustaining, who knows? So I'm now going to kind of pivot and start talking about hybridization and polyploidy and where some of our endemic species come from. I'm going to introduce you, well, not introduce you, you probably know them, common groundsel. You could probably walk out of your front door and find common groundsel within a few hundred meters. And depending where you live, the same might be true of Oxford ragwort as well. These are two common, widespread, and familiar species. Oxford groundsel is a native. Common groundsel is a native. Oxford ragwort is a non-native. It's originally, as the name doesn't suggest, it comes from the slopes of Mount Etna in Sicily. It was brought to the Oxford Botanic Gardens where it lived for a few decades. Then it hopped the wild, colonized the walls around Oxford. That's why we call it Oxford ragwort. And then when the railways came, it started spreading across Britain. Common groundsel has a chromosome number of 40. Oxford ragwort has a chromosome number of 20. I'm not going to talk about chromosomes too much because it's not the funnest thing in the world, but it is handy for understanding this next bit. Where these two species meet, they form a sterile hybrid called Baxter's ragwort or Baxter's groundsel. And because it's getting an unequal contribution of chromosomes from its parents, it ends up with 30 chromosomes and they can't pair up properly. And so you end up with a sterile hybrid plant that grows, can't produce seeds, dies off again. So, you don't get populations of Baxter's ragwort because it can't reproduce itself. It can only appear when these two species occur. However, at some point in history, something went wrong or possibly went right, and a plant of Baxter's groundsel doubled its chromosome number. It went from 30, which was no use for it to reproduce, to 60, having a double pair of everything, which meant, of course, they could all pair up neatly again, and it could produce pollen and it could regain fertility. And because it's got this increased chromosome number, it's reproductively isolated from both of its parents, and so is a fully fledged species. And the amazing thing about that is that this can happen so quickly because Baxter's groundsel is sterile and can't reproduce itself. It means within a calendar year, Baxter's ragwort grew the hybrid, made this mistake, and set seed of this new species. And so this new species was formed incredibly rapidly, which is kind of so different to kind of the traditional speciation and evolution that we hear about. It was first discovered in 1925, so happy centenary to the existence of Welsh groundsel. And in fact, the thing that blows my mind is that this species independently evolved twice. There was a Welsh groundsel was also discovered in Edinburgh and originated separately to the population in Wales, but through exactly the same mechanism. And so the other mind-blowing fact about this species is it evolved twice. The really agonizing thing, unfortunately, is that the Edinburgh lineage of it appears to be extinct. So it's great that the species still exists. That would have been fascinated to have this species that existed with two independent origins, and unfortunately, it seems that we've lost that. I was at the British and Irish Botanical Conference at this weekend where Dr. Trevor Dines was talking about surveys of this species this year, and they found 52 plants this year. And because it's an endemic, that is the only 52 plants in the entire world. So it is not doing particularly well, but it is doing better than our next species, the York groundsel. The York groundsel evolved from the same ancestors as the Welsh groundsel, common groundsel, and Oxford ragwort. It was first recognised in 1979, and it probably evolved not long before that. However, the mechanism through which it evolved is a little bit more opaque. It has a chromosome number of 40, which is the same as common groundsel. So it's not exactly sure how that evolved. Was it the case that that sterile hybrid Baxter's groundsel originated and then by some fluke thing managed to produce some pollen by shedding some chromosomes that was able to fertilize? Blah. I don't know. You don't know. But basically, it's a same parents, different chromosome number. It looks different, as you can see in these slides. You know, Welsh groundsel has those kind of like cheerful little sun-like flowers, whereas York groundsel has those longer petals and it has more spiky leaves. And it was only ever known from York, where it lived on disturbed ground, building sites, and pavement cracks. And because of the kind of modern obsession with tidying up perceived weeds in cracks and on walls and so on, the York groundsel went extinct by 2003. However, as I was researching Endemics in the same year that I was doing that, Andy Shaw of the British Rare Plants Nursery in Wales was given some seeds that had been in storage for 20 years at the Millennium Seed Bank and has revived it. And he invited me along to go throw out handfuls of seed in York. And earlier this year, some 1,000 or so plants were seen in York. And so its early stages are positive that we might have York groundsel back in the wild. But what's fascinating about this species and the previous species, Welsh groundsel, is that these are urban species. These are recently evolved species and their habitat is urban. It's not like their secondary habitat. It's not like they're somewhere else and they also do well in urban habitats like so many of our species. The habitat for which they have evolved is to live in urban areas alongside us. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. Now, you might be thinking, okay, James, you've told me the story of two species that have originated through hybrid speciation. And one of them went extinct and one of them is really rare. So, like, do any of these species ever do really well and succeed? And if you're thinking that, well, I've caught you out because there's another one, and this one is incredibly successful. This is common cordgrass. You may well have seen this species because there's a little map down there. You can see just how widespread it is. It is around most of the coasts of Britain and quite a large proportion of the coast of Ireland as well. This species arose from a hybrid event between the native small cordgrass and the non-native North American smooth cordgrass. And they produce a sterile hybrid between them. It was the late 1800s when people noticed that what they thought was the sterile hybrid seemed to be spreading. And in fact, probably through exactly the same mechanism of doubling its chromosomes, because the chromosome number of this newly emerged plant, Spartina anglica, was approximately double that of the hybrid. Though, as you can see on the slide, there's a mixture of chromosome numbers that have come out of studies, but it's got basically double the number of chromosomes, and it started to spread. And in fact, this species is in fact incredibly successful to the extent that it has been taken and introduced to other parts of the world to kind of stabilize mud. And maybe even accidentally introduced, that it is now an invasive species in part of the world. So this is a species that went from not existing 200 years ago to existing a century and a half ago through to now being a very widespread species in Britain, non-native in Ireland, non-native in the rest of the world, and indeed invasive in parts of the world as well. And that is an amazing trajectory for something that did not exist 2 centuries ago. So another mechanism through which endemic species can emerge is apomixis. Apomixis is the method through which a species essentially clones itself through its own seeds. And so I've put 2 examples on here, the Armingford Goldilocks buttercup and the fat-leaved hawkweed. So we have 58 described endemic Goldilocks buttercups, mostly in Cambridgeshire, Norfolk, Suffolk, and that's because that's where Alan Mesley, our former VCR for Cambridgeshire, did his PhD work and described them. But he said to me there may be 200 other undescribed species of Goldilocks buttercup elsewhere in Britain, which is incredible to think about, that we have possibly so many undescribed endemic species. These species are apomictic, so each one grows a flower. It needs to get pollen from another individual, but when it does, it ignores the genetic material from the pollen. That just serves to stimulate seed development, and then it grows a seed which is a clone of itself. And presumably what happens is that in different areas of the country, that process is occasionally faulty. Mutations creep in. And over time, especially if those mutations are beneficial, populations will drift away from each other. And it's really interesting to go and look at different populations of Goldilocks buttercups, because you will see some of them have beautiful flowers with a full complement of petals, but some of them, like in this picture here, this is the Bax Goldilocks buttercup, Ranunculus cantabrigensis of Cambridge, often doesn't bother growing petals at all. And their leaf shapes, their basal leaf shapes, vary dramatically from site to site. And if you're interested in seeing Goldilocks buttercups, then you want to be out in April and May looking at churchyards and woodland rides. And if you happen to be in Cambridgeshire, Norfolk, Suffolk, and you've got a copy of Sella Morel, that's the guide that has information on how to identify or try to identify some of these Goldilocks species. The other group that is majority apomictic is the hawkweeds. So we've got 293 in Britain. We've got a pretty good understanding of their distribution in comparison to the Goldilocks. All of our endemic species are apomictic, and so they've probably diverged in a similar way. We do have Hieracium umbellatum, which is a sexually reproducing species, and I'm not sure whether that ever contributes into speciation as it does in other groups that have apomixis, like the white beams, which we'll talk about in a moment. Most of our endemic hawkweeds are kind of found in the northwest uplands, islands, and many of those are actually critically endangered with tens of individuals or fewer. But I will talk a little bit more about that at the end. And if you're interested in the species that's in the picture, that is Hieracium leanum, the fat-leaved hawkweed, which I saw in Wales. Now, I've talked about hybridization and I've talked about apomixis, that kind of cloning, individuals cloning themselves. But sometimes those two mechanisms collide with each other. And that can be a really great way that new species generate themselves. So there's a couple of beautiful white beams here. Lay's white beam, which I think has like 9 trees in Wales. And here's the Menai Strait white beam, which is on the coast between mainland Wales and Anglesey, where there's maybe 30 of those trees in the world, in the wild. So both kind of mind-blowingly rare species. But the species I'm really interested to talk about um, is one that originated through hybridization of two non-endemic species. So here we have rowan on the left, a common familiar tree that I'm sure you've all seen, often planted around supermarket car parks. And on the right, we have rock whitebeam, which is another non-endemic species, but one that has a scattered distribution in Britain. And as you can see, they look very different to each other in a lot of ways. Rowan has those pinnate leaves, and rock whitebeam has those entire leaves. And if you've ever seen it in person, it often has a kind of a slightly dished or cupped or spoon-like shape to those leaves. Now, on the Isle of Arran, these species hybridized with each other, and they ended up leading to the formation of this new species, the Arran whitebeam. So rowan is a sexually reproducing whitebeam species, and rock whitebeam reproduces apomictically. So presumably at some point, some pollen from rock whitebeam ended up reaching a rowan. It created this hybrid offspring that was triploid, and triploids are usually sterile, but because it presumably inherited the ability to reproduce apomictically from the rock whitebeam ancestor, it was therefore able to reproduce itself. And there was a survey done on Arran in 2007, and they found 407 trees. So this species has become incredibly successful. It's more common on Arran than rock whitebeam, its ancestors, which I think is absolutely fantastic. The thing is that process did not stop there, because the Arran whitebeam at some point crossbred back to rowan again. And you can see here that this cycle has repeated itself several times. We've got the Arran whitebeam in the top left. It then crossbred back to rowan, producing the Arran service tree in the top right. And you can see it's got even more dissected leaves and some free leaflets at the bottom, which come from the rowan ancestor. And then the Arran service tree crossbred back to rowan again and produced that gorgeous thing at the bottom there, which is the catechol whitebeam, which is very like a rowan, but it has that very, very large leaflet at the tip. So the Arran whitebeam, successful, 407 trees. Arran service tree, just as successful, maybe even slightly more so, 436 trees in the wild. However, the catechol whitebeam has one mature tree in the wild, which is here in the photo. It's that multi-stemmed tree there. There is a rowan growing in front of it, but like 12 of those 13 trunks are trunks of this multi-stemmed individual of catechol whitebeam, and then perhaps two saplings in the wild, which makes it probably one of the rarest wild plants on the planet, which is fascinating to hear about, especially given the fact that probably when people are thinking about endangered species, they probably think tigers, rhinos, some sort of rare parrot or something like that. And they're probably thinking about somewhere overseas, somewhere that's not Britain. And in fact, we've got one of the rarest trees on the planet here, and many of our hawkweeds are incredibly rare. And the great ormberry that I was telling you about with 6 individuals, it's kind of amazing to think that we have these things that are so rare, and yet they're not kind of meeting the public consciousness. Another species I'd like to talk to you about briefly is interrupted brome. This species was discovered kind of weirdly late. Botany, as I'm sure you're aware, is one of the kind of is an old discipline in Britain. And so for something to be discovered in 1849 that had never been seen before, people wondered if it was an alien species or something like that. And it was described as a species in 1895. However, it was never found anywhere else in the world. I think there was one record of it as an alien in the Netherlands, and that's probably introduced from Britain, but it was never found anywhere else in the world. And it now appears that it has evolved recently in Britain from soft brome. It became extinct, though, unfortunately, at its last site in 1972, and the collections of seed that had been made of it were inviable. So it's thought to be fully extinct and gone for good. However, at a BSBI conference in Manchester in 1979, it was dramatically revealed that someone had been growing it on their windowsill for a number of years. And from that collection of material, more plants were grown, more seed was collected, and reintroductions were attempted in 2003, the first reintroduction of an extinct British plant species. Hooray! However, both of those reintroductions failed within a few years due to, I think a tree fell down and all the plants got eaten. Sheep got in, ate all the plants. Another one, I think, was herbicide drift. So interrupted brome went extinct again in Britain. However, of course, there were very good seed collections at that point, and it was reintroduced again. And now today, it is on a farm not far from its last site in Cambridgeshire. It's also grown at College Lakes in Buckinghamshire, and then there are hundreds upon hundreds of plants that grow at Plant Life's Reserve, Ranscombe Farm in Kent, if you want to ever see it for yourself, which you should, because it is beautiful. So I've been talking a lot about species in Britain, because that was my kind of my original focus. But I did want to kind of shine a light on species elsewhere in Britain and Ireland, because this is, I'm doing a BSBI talk, and so I should. And so, as far as I can tell, Ireland is home to 16 plants that are only found in Ireland. 7 dandelions, 6 hawkweeds, 2 white beams, and 1 orchid. I have seen one of these species, which is this one here, which is the Irish whitebeam Sorbus hibernica. It's had a kind of like, as with many of our whitebeams, it had a kind of a slow journey towards recognition. The oldest record of this species in a herbarium is from 1885, but at the time people didn't really know what it was. Pugsley and Prager found it when they were out botanizing together in 1933 and thought perhaps it was grey-leaved whitebeam, Sorbus porygentiformis, but it was formally described as Sorbus hibernica by Warburg in 1952. And it's quite widespread in Ireland, with more than 300 trees found kind of widely across the island of Ireland. And much like the whitebeams of Arran, it's a triploid apomyct. It is cloning itself through its seeds and fruit. So 16 things completely unique to Ireland. Now, if you put Britain and Ireland together, there are also other species that are endemic to Britain and Ireland as a whole. And so here is that combined list. So this is everything endemic to Britain, everything endemic to Ireland, as well as things that are endemic to both of those places at the same time. And as you can see, that bumps up the list further from, it was 641 endemics for Britain. If you look at Britain and Ireland together, then it jumps up to 761 species. And as you can see, the hawkweed number really jumps up, the bramble number really jumps up, and the dandelions and whitebeam number really jumps up as well. So to give an example of one of those species, there is the English whitebeam, Sorbus anglica. What a bad name that is, because this is a species that is found in Britain, but is also found in Ireland as well. It's the first herbarium collection is from 1836, but a name wasn't correctly put to it until 1914. Before then, people were trying to reconcile it with various other already described species. It was only in 1914 that someone went, oh yeah, this is actually unique. It's really successful considering I've told you about various of our endemics that are highly restricted and have small numbers of trees, and many of our endemic whitebeams do have very small populations. I talked about Lay's whitebeam with like 9 trees, the Menai Strait whitebeam with 30 trees. Some of the Cheddar Gorge endemics have very small numbers of trees, but the Sorbus anglica has really kind of been incredibly successful. It's got 1,000+ trees in Britain, found in southwest England and Wales. Plus, it's found in Ireland as well, in North Kerry. And I was intrigued there's a reference to it growing with strawberry tree in Ireland, because obviously there's been the recent research showing that strawberry tree may have been an ancient introduction with people into Ireland. And yeah, has it reached Ireland through being bird sown by some thrush eating some berries, flying across to Ireland and then depositing them there? Or could there possibly be some human transit involved in it between Britain and Ireland? I don't know. I'm completely wildly speculating. But when I read that, I thought that was interesting. And what's interesting about this species is it's a fertile tetraploid. It can sexually reproduce. And if you open up the fruit of Sorbus anglica, there's a lot of ripe seed in there. I've done this. I've opened up some of the seeds of the Arran whitebeams, and you may find, one fertile seed per fruit, or maybe a couple. Whereas in Sorbus anglica, lots and lots of plump seeds. So it's got much higher fertility. And I suppose over time, that is going to lead to you being a more abundant species, because you're kind of more able to take advantage of the fact if a bird picks up your fruit and flies somewhere else and deposits your seeds somewhere, if those seeds are fertile, you're more likely to spread. And then on my next slide, I have pulled together a slightly more updated list, which is Britain, Ireland, Isle of Man, and Channel Islands, because of course that's the entire remit of the BSBI. And that brings it up to a really delightfully, not really round, but satisfying number of 777 species. Though, as I said before, there's probably going to be some revisions in Eyebrights, and so we may see that number decline slightly. By bringing in the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands, we get one more dandelion and 15 more brambles as well. So that brings me to a slide about conservation. Some of it's the similar things I've been saying as I go along. Great Ormberry, 6 wild plants. Baker's hawkweed, which is one of the plants I went and saw whilst researching endemics. I was interested in seeing Baker's hawkweed because I read there were only 3 plants left in the wild. When I went in 2022, me and Linda Robinson, the Vice County Recorder for VC 65, we could only find a single plant. The Catacall whitebeam, 1 mature tree and perhaps 2 saplings. Lay's whitebeam, 9 trees. The Hepst hawkweed, 5 plants. The Beacon's hawkweed, a single wild plant. And 10 of our endemic plant species are thought to be extinct. 8 of them hawkweeds and 3 of brambles. And if you're paying attention, that number doesn't make sense, because if you add 8 and 3 together, you get 11. And that's because I rapidly was updating this slide, because in the last BSBI news, the Glenridding hawkweed, which is this one on the picture here, was rediscovered. So actually, that shouldn't say 8 species of hawkweed, it should now say 7 species of hawkweed. So we have a joyful update. And then we've got 3 plant species which are classed as extinct in the wild. The York groundsel, which I mentioned, which of course has been reintroduced, but we need to give it time to make sure it's self-sustaining in the wild. The interrupted brome, which I also mentioned, once again, there needs to be time to make sure it's self-sustaining in the wild. And the Clitherhill hawkweed of Shetland, in which there are attempts to try and get this back into the wild, but nobody's going to say it's living in the wild until there's good evidence that it's sustaining itself in the wild. Why am I so obsessed with endemics? Well, partly I think that you could argue that the most important thing we could be conserving in Britain or Britain, Ireland, or indeed Britain, Ireland, the Isle of Man, and the Channel Islands are the species that are irreplaceable, the ones that we can never do a reintroduction with stock from overseas because they don't exist overseas. These are the species that are utterly irreplaceable. And so that's why they fascinate me. So if our endemics are arguably our most important species, and the vast majority of them are plants, then you could say the most important group that we could be working on in Britain from a conservation perspective is plants. And that is why it's a delight to work for the BSBI, to work with all the Vice County recorders and volunteers and members that make the BSBI successful. And why it's so wonderful to be giving you this talk, telling you that by being involved with the BSBI, you are arguably supporting the most important plant group in Britain. So, what are the problems? What are the solutions? There's a lack of knowledge in the general public about endangered species in general. People, when they think about endangered species, they are not thinking about hawkweeds and white beams and great ormberry and interrupted brome. And we can be doing more to kind of change that perception and tell these stories. But to do that, we need those images and stories to engage people with them. There are knowledge gaps in the conservation sector about endemic species. When I was writing about endemics and talking to people about endemics, I had a few people who work in conservation say to me, oh, endemic species, I kind of think of that as something that happens on like an island somewhere. And I have to say to people, yes, we are an island somewhere. So even within the conservation sector, there are people that don't realize we have species that are utterly irreplaceable. There are a lack of people with identification skills in these critical groups. The people that exist are incredible and amazing, and they are really quite few. These are difficult groups, the hawkweeds, the brambles, the buttercups. It would be great if we had more people interested in those groups. It feels there's a lack of funding and interest in tracking down missing species. That's less of a plant thing. That's kind of more of an invertebrate thing, I think. That said, it's really interesting looking at endemic species on the BSBI's database because there are species that haven't been recorded for a few years, and often they are difficult endemic species that are hard to identify. And there's a quote here at the bottom which basically says endemic species must be recognized and weighted more heavily in national assessment processes. Basically, endemic species, we should make them more important in decision making, which of course I agree with. If you have enjoyed listening to this and you want to hear some different stories, as Sarah said, there is my book, Endemic. You can find it. It's available at places books are sold. And if you would like to ask me any questions about this, feel free to send me a message on Blue Sky, add me on LinkedIn or whatever. I really enjoy talking about endemic species, as you might have picked up. So do shoot me any questions you have. But of course, you can ask me some now.
Brilliant, fantastic. Thank you so much, James. I will doubly again endorse the book, especially because I don't know so much about non-botanical subjects, and I found all those sections really, really interesting as well. And I would say you haven't done justice to the stories around some of your discoveries as well, and those were fantastically laid out in the book as well. But we have some questions. Jan, or more specifically Jan's iPad, but I assume Jan behind it, has asked, what is an infraspecies, please?
Infraspecies. So that's presumably from that quote at the beginning. Infraspecies kind of covers the subspecies, varieties, etc. So it's kind of any of those categorizations lumped together that are smaller than species.
Thank you. She also asks, which are the orchids, and do you have any pictures? Which might be a bit of a juggle, but which are the orchids, the endemic orchids?
Yeah, so I mean, orchids are another one of those groups where I wouldn't be surprised in there's a lot of work going on in orchids. Orchids are very complicated genetically. It wouldn't surprise me if some of those orchids in future turned out not to be endemic species, but in terms of a British endemic, currently the Lindisfarne helleborine, Epipactis sancta, which is only found on Lindisfarne. If you've watched the recent 28 Years Later film, that's where you want to be to go see Epipactis sancta. But it wouldn't surprise me if that ended up being lumped with another species. Pugsley's marsh orchid is a British and Irish endemic orchid. In Ireland, there's Dactylorhiza kerriensis as well. But to be honest, I didn't particularly go out of my way to track down the orchids because orchids are so popular and so well covered in things like John Donne's orchid book and so on, that I thought I wanted to kind of shine a light on the things that people probably weren't already vaguely aware of in some way. That said, if you follow me on Blue Sky, I'll post a picture of Epipactis sancta just for you because I did go look at it the other year.
Thank you. Leah asks, what was the name of the Goldilocks Buttercup identification guide?
So there's a 5 volume set of books by Sell and Murrell. Sell, spelled exactly as you'd imagine, Murrell, Murrell. I think they're called the Flora of Britain and Ireland. They are absolutely magnificent tomes of plant identification. They're also quite expensive.
I was going to say the right one here, but I do have two currently in my
Yes,
possession, which are not for me to be holding on to for very long. Yes, they are very like hen's teeth.
yes, they're incredible. I once bought a car that cost less than one of those books, so they are tricky to get your hands on. That said, if you're interested in learning more about Goldilocks buttercups, probably the most accessible and useful resource is the Flickr pages of Brian Eversham, who's the CEO of the Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire, and Northamptonshire Wildlife Trusts. And he has tracked down a lot of these species and taken beautiful pictures of the flowers, the range of the basal leaf shapes, and sometimes landscape shots. So you can actually see where the plant is in relation to like the church. So you can walk right up and look at it. And so, yeah, if you Google Brian Eversham Goldilocks buttercups, then that is an absolutely amazing and much more accessible resource.
Thank you very much. Ruby asks, they say, that was excellent, thank you. Have you got any ideas on how we can improve interest from the general public, possibly using UK rare natives in public planting?
That's interesting. I was actually talking to somebody who's talking about a new botanic garden type thing that's going to be opened in Leeds. And I was talking about, oh, it'd be great to put maybe some of the rare hawkweeds on it and so on. So I've kind of had a conversation a bit like that. A lot of botanic gardens do that. Go to Cambridge Botanic Garden, you can see the great ormberry and some of our white beams. I was up at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Edinburgh, and they've got Sorbus anglica, Sorbus porygentiformis, and all 3 of the Arran white beams. More broadly in public planting, I suppose it's things that are where there isn't the kind of specialist care for them. It would have to be things that can kind of look after themselves. I think the white beams are pretty good for that. And it could be that some of the white beams would be nice trees to grow. Though, of course, that does bring the question of if you plant them somewhere outside of their native range and they start seeding somewhere else, are we kind of messing up the biogeography of the species as well? So it's an interesting idea. The Menai straight white beam, which is threatened by sea level rise on the coast of Anglesey, one of the ideas was maybe that could be planted as a bit of a street tree, but just in that area of kind of North Wales and Anglesey to kind of keep it within the zone of where it evolved and lived. So there are probably kind of hybrid solutions based around that idea.
Yeah. I liked your last-ish slide on the conservation ongoing, and you answered one of my questions, which was going to be why the correlation sort of between endemics and these, difficult species, if in inverted commas, some of them. But I was wondering, Do you think that these are things that are overlooked because we don't expect to find them, or because we don't know what to look for, or because they're so localized that the chances of the right person coming across them necessarily is lower?
I think it's probably um, the latter point, the right person coming across them, because I'm a relatively enthusiastic botanist, but if I see a hawkweed, I run a mile basically because they're a difficult, they are a genuinely difficult group. So I mean, that in a way, it's almost a positive thing. I've just listed some of those species that are, eight of them are thought, seven of them are thought to be extinct. There are several of them that are down to single individuals. Maybe there's more of them, and we just haven't got the right people looking in the right place. And of course, the Glen Ridding hawkweed that was just rediscovered, that was last seen in 1953, but has been rediscovered by the right person going to the right place. However, the other side of that is what is slowly being lost that doesn't have the right person realizing it's slowly being lost. So it would be great to have more materials, resources, training in rubus, hyraceum, goldilocks, buttercups, white beans.
Yeah. Nif says they've been studying a species of sea lavender and it's got them hooked, and they're hoping to work towards a PhD and would love to continue working on them. In your opinion, what would be a useful path to follow?
Gosh, um, a path sort of career wise, or
I guess in terms of studying sea lavender, subspecies of sea lavenders, yeah.
I mean, I would make sure that you're linked in with somebody like Alex Prendergast, senior vascular plant expert at Natural England, who I know he's been doing work on the different sea lavender species, subspecies on the East Anglian coast, has been trialing a key for those species. So I suppose it's networking in with those people who are currently enthusiastic about tracking down these species at different locations. And just a slight aside on sea lavenders, on Lundy, off the coast of Devon, there is an old record of a sea lavender being seen there, and it has never been found again on Lundy. So whether that was some unique endemic thing that has been lost from Lundy, or maybe it's still hanging on the coast of Lundy somewhere unseen, is kind of tantalizing and fascinating. It does make you wonder how many things we may have lost a little before we started paying full attention to these things.
Hmm. Brilliant, they say. Awesome, thank you. If there are any other questions, we have just got a minute or so. But otherwise, I mean, James, any next ideas for next books, next things to get engrossed in?
Well, one of the things that you end up inevitably confronting when talking about endemic species is rarity, and I think we often hear when we're talking about conservation in Britain, this species is rare, this species is rare, this species has been introduced, but we're not seeing that from a global perspective. The wonderful thing about endemics is you are considering conservation from a global perspective. And it's made me wonder about what is rare in Britain from a global perspective. And I think some of the answers to that are really interesting. We have most of the bluebell woods in the world, which is something that we're probably all
Hmm.
quite familiar with, but actually globally, we're really important for bluebell woods. Chalk rivers, we've got 80 something percent of all the chalk rivers in the entire world, which is probably not something that most people think about. And so, yeah, I'm quite interested in things that we don't think of as rare but are rare globally, and things that we think of as incredibly rare but actually globally are fine, and kind of the whole spectrum in between those things.
Brilliant. Nigel asks, where you have taxa which readily speciate, where does the balance lie between protecting the existing species we have and protecting the conditions, e.g., large areas of semi-natural habitat, which allow speciation to take place?
Oh gosh, what a great question. I mean,
We'll finish on that one, so go.
I think in a way you can almost do both at the same time because there are, to take the white beams as an example, there are hotbeds of white beam speciation: Cheddar Gorge, the Avon Gorge, parts of North Devon, Wye Valley, etc. And it appears that whatever is going on in those places, if we protect the endemic species that live in those places, we are protecting that landscape, and thus we're protecting whatever is going on in those places that allows these species to speciate, which is presumably they can hybridize, they can colonize rock faces as there's rock slides and so on, and generate new species. Though I do think there's a kind of a slight tangent on that, which is we, in the most recent red list, which you may have read about, I think Pete Stroh, who wrote that, he mentions that under the IUCN guidelines, you can't list hybrids as being threatened, and I think that's really interesting because in my talk today, I mentioned about how many of these species will have had an intermediate stage as a hybrid. And so if we lose hybrids, we're losing a mechanism through which species can generate. And so there's a really interesting thing there about hybrids being a place through which species can originate. And yet when, as far as the red list is concerned, we're not conserving hybrids and their kind of potential for future speciation, which I think is a really interesting kind of niche case on that front.
Great. Thank you so much, James. I look forward to our next generation of Iraceum rubus specialists that will be born out of all of this. And I think if released 50 of those people into the landscape, we'd probably end up with twice as many endemics before the generation was out. But thank you so much. We will be putting this talk up on YouTube. The thanks are pouring in, which is fantastic to see. So please do go and recap it there if you'd like to, and share it onwards with other people. And we have our following sessions of winter talks coming up. The next one is on the first Wednesday in January. We've also got one on the third Wednesday in January, and then forwards into February and March. So you can check out and book for those ones on our website. But thanks again to James. And it just remains for me to say, I hope everyone has a lovely evening, and thank you for coming. Thank you all. Bye.